End of the voyage. With the Horn safely rounded, I hoped to stand to the north past Staten Island, and to go inside the Falklands between the Falklands and Patagonia, since the currents favor that way and it possesses the great advantage of avoiding the worst of the ice fields. The spring ice is generally worse to the east of the Falklands for some reason than it is actually off the Horn. But the wind now came from the northwest, and I could not head to the westward of the Falklands. I could only stand on to pass them on their eastward side. So I stood on across the Birdwood bank to make towards the southeast trades 3,000 miles away. The passage of the South Atlantic towards the trades was pleasant enough, though off the Plate we had a hard gale. We saw an ice island on the Birdwood bank, probably round. It was low, long, and much worn. The sky, even in the night, was white above it. I would have investigated this a little more closely had I had a fair wind, but the wind was ahead, and I could give nothing away. There was no telling how far the spurs reached from beyond this ice, beneath the surface. I held my course and kept away, and hoped to see no more. On the Atlantic side of the Horn we saw many more seabirds than we had seen on the Pacific side. The albatrosses, which had been almost entirely missing in the Pacific, showed up again, though they were never numerous. We saw much kelp for several hundred miles past the Falklands, and later seemed to come into a whale's feeding ground, where the blue whales sported, and the blackfish and the porpoises, all of them, one morning were feeding together, each in their own herd. In the gale off the Plate I had to heave to again. The sea once more smashed the light brackets, which the carpenter had carefully remade. The squalls blew with fury, and the driving rain was like a horny-handed slap across the face. But it did not last long. Every day brought us then to finer weather, and we did not mind an odd gale, though the disturbance off the Plate set up such a sea that the motion of the ship seemed worse than it had ever been before. For the first time from my place beside the helmsman aft, I saw the jib boom washed clean, and watched the sea rise above the reeling foretop. It was impossible to stand or to stay erect without clinging to some support. It rained a great deal, but after 8 hours I could put the helm up and go on, and that was the last of the really bad weather we had. The conditions were disturbed for a few days, but we made steady northing towards the trade. The days now passed in peace, and there was warmth in the air. All the Cape Horn lashings could come off, the skylights were opened, and the caulking taken from the doors. The sidelight brackets were again replaced, and the pigs removed to their sty on deck. On the day we reached the southeast trade we killed a pig as fresh food. In 2 days he was all gone. The cats began to show themselves on deck, and even to prowl the scuppers when there was no water there, on the lookout for flying fish. The carpenter set to work with an axe, his best tool, to shape a new fore-topmast from the last of the spars I had shipped in Melbourne. He worked about the decks all day long, for he was Damon again now, he and the sailmaker, with an axe and a broad smile and endless energy. A primitive from the far north, fair-skinned and stalwart, he had been at sea in sailing ships since he was 14. He walked to his first ship, the wooden bark Warma, loading timber at some port in North Sweden. He walked from Finland, though he knew no word of the Swedish language, using the wild Finnish tongue, and at length, after many days, he saw the mast of a bark showing above a forest. He went on board. It was the Warma. On deck was an old man, rough and tough, sitting sewing sails. He was a very rough-looking man, unshaven and unkempt. He looked more like an old and not very successful farmer than a sailor in a sailing ship. "Hullo," he said to the boy, "what do you want?" "I want to see the captain," said the 14-year-old boy, very hungry. "I'm the captain," said the tough one, spitting in the scuppers. "Well, I'm the new man from Finland," said the boy. Then they were both surprised, but the boy was signed on, and he became a good sailor. He was at sea 2 years before he saw soft bread, and 4 years before he knew that milk could be kept in cans. They don't get condensed milk in the Finnish Baltic sailors. Before he shipped for this round world voyage, he had never seen pickles, tomato sauce, or jam, and he had never eaten toast or seen curry. He had been master of a barkentine and mate of several barks. They live hard in the short voyage ships of Finland. I stood on quietly towards the line on the grain ship's track. I thought of looking in at the island of Trinidad, where there is supposed to be some treasure buried. It is the usual old pirate on his deathbed and secret plan story. Not that we wanted treasure, but we could use some firewood, and there is said to be plenty on the beach there. However, there were 2 insuperable difficulties. In the first place, Trinidad is one of the most difficult islands in the world on which to land, and secondly, the wind would not allow me to stand towards it. The wind, when we arrived at those latitudes, ought to have been from the southeast. Unfortunately, it was from the northwest. So I stood on towards Fernando Noronha, planning to cross the line farther west than the grain ships do, since I was bound to New York, and they are always bound to Europe. Crossing the Rio Lane, a sharp lookout was kept for steamers, in order that we might ask for a report. Through their radio to Lloyd's in London, we were out then more than 2 months, and had not seen anything beyond one distant glance at Rurutu, and another a month later at Staten Island. But we crossed the Rio Lane and saw nothing, except one tramp outward bound in ballast, which passed us in a shower of rain. We were then completely lost to the world, and remained so indeed for more than 90 days. During which we had no communication with anything, and no one on earth knew where we were. In that time we had sailed over 11,000 miles, but we had crossed only 3 steamer tracks. Away from steamer lanes, the whole ocean is now quieter and more lonely than it has ever been since first man sailed the Western Ocean, except in the trade winds belt of the South Pacific, where there is always the chance of meeting a stray small yacht. The southeast trade was very quiet when at last it came, but if the wind was quiet and we could do no better than 130 or 140 miles a day, we could at least get on with the work. The work in an iron full-rigged ship is endless. All hands were now busy engaged from daylight to dark, cleaning off the rust from the run to the horn. It was curious how every one forgot so quickly about that place, and getting the metalwork of the ship in good order to be painted, cleaning the boats, chipping, scraping, red leading, tarring, morning, noon, and night. The topmen Jan, Hilgard, and Dennis worked barebacked in their own riggings. Jan the fore, Hilgard the main, and Dennis the mizzen. There were 101 things needing attention on each mast. Keeping up a ship at sea is an art unto itself, an art requiring infinite labor, great patience, good organization, and good workmen. The topmen were the best of the young sailors. Jan and Hilgard were able seamen. Dennis was one of the youngest of the cadets. He came aboard at Ipswich, an insignificant little chap aged 14, from the borders of Wales, and for a long time his principal occupations seemed to be to grin and to make a loud noise upon every possible occasion, but Dennis blossomed out quickly into a fine little sailor. He filled out and grew rapidly, and he took well to the niceties of sailor's art. He was a first-class sailor, but like most of the other boys, he had no intention of following the sea as a profession. His reason was that life as an officer in a steamship did not attract him. "I like it here," he said. "This is fun, and it's being alive too, but what is there in a steamer?" I had no answer for him, but it is a pity that the maritime profession of Great Britain in these days is so unattractive that it cannot keep these boys. Of all the boys who came in the ship, only 3 left with the intention of following the sea as a profession. John Delvin, whose family had been masters in British sail for generations, and the redoubtable Hardcase and Stormalong. "I'll stay at sea if I have to go in a barge," said the solid-minded Hardcase, who was a surprisingly deep thinker for a boy, and always a youth who knew his own mind. He had a good mind too. I liked the Hardcase. Little harum-scarum as he sometimes was, there was depth to him, depth, spirit, and plenty of character. He will get on. His former schoolmate, Stormalong, was much the same, except that he was even smaller and upon occasion could make more noise. Stormalong had a merry twinkle in his eyes that even hurricanes could not shift. He could smile with the toothache, and that takes spirit. There were many occasions when I was glad this pair had come on board, though, as they said themselves, they had first approached the ship in some alarm and had expected to be thrown off. They joined with grins that spread from ear to ear, and they never quite lost the sense of pleasure that just being in the ship brought to them. That was the kind of boy I wanted. When that surveyor who had come down hotfoot to the ship at Harwich before I sailed was asking the boys about the hell ship allegations, the stupid work of some crazy fellow whose application to join I had refused, young Goodchild up and spoke to him. "Hell ship, sir," he said. "She seems like a bit of heaven to me." And that was the end of that inquiry. John was a good lad too, a year or 2 older than the younger boys. He knew he was going to follow the sea, and realized the value of his opportunity in this ship. He never let a chance to learn anything go by, though much of our seamanship was antiquated, and little of it is now necessary for the modern officers' certificates, but it was still a magnificent groundwork, a foundation in the ancient calling of the sea, a coming to grips with the elements upon the ocean, and an experience which would stand the mariner in good stead throughout his life, and not only the mariner. John was from south of England. Neville, in the Yorkshire boy, was from the north. Neville was a quiet little fellow when he came on board, but he did not remain that way very long. A wild mop of long black hair, a rosy face that grinned very easily, a good wit, a lanky form that was sometimes difficult to raise from a recumbent position at the end of watch below, an abundant energy that did not find in toil a sufficient outlet. This was Master Neville from the Captain Cook country of North Yorkshire. He was a good scout. I liked Neville, liked all the lads. The 3 New Zealanders who stayed for the Cape Horn passage was good scouts, too. One of them, a youth named Crawford, with his irrepressible humor, his dry repartee, his love of jokes, was a tower of good will in the ship. Such a fellow adds tremendously to the harmony of a small community, turning aside the little trials of the day, always with a joke. There was one feature about the boys and about that voyage for which, looking back on it, I feel most grateful, and that was that when a discontent came and the indolent had been with us too long, it was they who left, and the rest never became disaffected. By the natural process of elimination, we had a pretty good gang for this last passage. Some who had left would still have fitted in splendidly. We could have done particularly with Ed, Fred, and Tony, and Andrew LeGrice from our Western Ocean passage. And if a fellow left because he did not want any more malaria, I could not blame him. Of the eight Americans who had been with the ship at one time or another, we had now only one, not reckoning the stalwart Hilgard from Lendom, who was no freshman in a sailing ship. This was Andrew Lindsay from St. Louis in Missouri, and a sturdy lad he was. Like the English boys, the Americans also had no intention of following a sea career, though they might have wished to do so. The reason, too, was the same. The profession under their own flag did not appeal to them. Since I knew little of these conditions, I could not argue with them, but I could at least point out that since they now had so excellent a foundation of experience behind them, they ought to find it easier to rise to the top, and having risen, they could then exert their influence to bring about an improvement in the general conditions for officers in their merchant service. If both merchant services, that of Great Britain and that of the United States, are to continue to have slight appeal for many of the best of the use of both countries, there cannot fail to be a falling off in the standard of officer personnel. I had other boys who had joined with some idea of following the sea. I used to encourage them to visit steamships in port, so that they could see something of conditions there, since I knew full well our kind of seafaring was very different from that of the usual run of vessels in the merchant navy, except in the cases of the determined John, Hardcase, and Stormalong, each of whom in effect said, "This is my profession, and I will make my way." They were inclined to think, upon reflection, upon talking with cadets and young officers in steamers, that there were better opportunities on the land. My training ship scheme did not seem to have achieved much good, but I venture to believe that the experiences the boys had in my ship, profound and memorable as some of them must have been, did help to guide their development along sound lines, whatever profession or calling they may later adopt. Even those who left, most of them were glad that they had come. Any real training scheme must extend far beyond one small ship to be of value in the maritime profession. So far as anything of real service was concerned, I well knew that I was nothing but an adventurer on the far outskirts, an onlooker with some queer ideas, whose only merit was that he had had the courage to try them. We were 75 days to the line, crossing on the longitude of 35 west. We had sailed over our outward track in the South Atlantic twice by then, and had gone round the world, but New York was still 3,000 miles away, and Ipswich to us 6,000. Neptune came on board to initiate the 3 New Zealanders with all the old ceremony. Neptune in the person of Wiry Jim, with his full court of barbers, doctors, nurses, police, and so forth, and Davy Jones, all well made up. This was on a Sunday. On other days the work went on, and gradually the ship began to emerge from beneath all the chipping hammers and the scrapers and the tar and the red lead as a thing of sleek beauty and freshly painted grace, until it was a delight to walk the decks by day and night and look upon the picture of her clean and well-kept decks in the shadows of the trade wind sails. I did not change the fore topmast at sea, since we were able to carry the topsail and 2 headsails without difficulty. I carried the studding sails forward to help the balance of the canvas. The strong gales we had had and the long, hard driving, however, had been a strain on the rigging. Stout as it was, things began to go. The foreyard, one of the most important yards in the ship, was found to be badly sprung. It had to be fished, but I thought it prudent to send down the studding sails to relieve the yard. It was a pity, but it could not be helped. We had no piece of timber long enough to make a new foreyard. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with the ship. Any small vessel with wooden masts and yards must suffer on such a long voyage. Taking the beatings we took from the tropics and the wintry roads of Good Hope and the Horn, we were not aloft very different from the Bounty, the Swallow, the Duff, or the Endeavour, all of which had carried a full spare mast and yet had frequently to stop while their shipwrights and carpenters cut down trees and shaped new spars. The springing of a yard or two, and even a mast, must be regarded in such ships as at least a predictable accident upon any circumnavigation. A week in a good shipyard would have put us in excellent order again, fit for 10 more such voyages, or even another 2 weeks in Nassau Lagoon. If we could have got a spar, the ship was all right, but I knew I had to nurse her now for the sake of the rigging. There could be no thought of overhaul before New York, and we had still something of the West Indies hurricane season before us. It was the middle of September then, and we had at least 4 weeks of sailing to do. In these circumstances I found the discourse of the carpenter encouraging, for he had been on a passage in the noble Warma of 110 days from the Mediterranean to Copenhagen, in the course of which the vessel sprung 6 spars and the jib boom and the mizzen topmast. They fished the lot, he said, and they went on. We also went on, and the doldrums were kind. We had only 1 day of calm. I put out the starboard lifeboat, which had been repaired, and the boys went rowing, fishing, and swimming. In the watch below, they sunbathed on the houses to bring back their coats of tan. The northeast trade came gently to us on 12 degrees north, and I then headed directly for New York, steering for the port for the first time in 89 days of sailing. By night the sea was black, with streaks of light where the porpoise played before the bow. There was no noise but the roll of foam as the rolling cutwater slowly plowed its way. The side lights shone on the studding sails, full of the fresh, soft air of the gentle trade. They had all the sails swelling above us in the peace of the tranquil night. The lookout leant on the capstan, while the tired watch rolled in their blankets on the forecastle head, slept the sleep of youth, deep and dreamless lay the sea all round, while gently and with silent grace the little ship sailed on. The lights of New York, tinted red upon the clouds, showed 100 miles at sea. After we had first seen them on a cold evening in mid-October, we still had to sail 2 days to make a landfall, for the conditions, as ever, were adverse. The winds were not good, and the weather was cold. It blew a little from the northwest, and the Gulf Stream threw up a lumpy and uncomfortable sea, in which the little ship plunged and rolled. I was worried about the rigging, about that and other things, for I knew that I could go no further. With this port safely made, the voyage was done. I knew very well that with 70,000 miles of the sea behind me and the voyage made, my arrival in New York could mean nothing but the climax of my worries, and then they would be overcome, but it was certain that I could not go on to England. We picked up the Fire Island Light at at long last, after sailing 106 days from Tahiti without seeing anything but the heights of Cape Horns, Staten Island, and the hazy outlines of Rurutu a month earlier. Yet the sailing had not been monotonous, and the voyage was not long. In the morning we were in the liner lanes outside America's great port, and the steamers came, all hurrying and very busy. And the pilot was on board, bringing with him some newspapers that, in a world of chaos, shrieked of inconsequential things. The good pilot gave us a bag of fresh meat that tasted fine. It was almost calm then, but it breezed up with the night, and we sailed in to the examination anchorage off Staten Island, and the sound of the cable roaring through the hawse was both welcome and sad, for I knew it was most unlikely that I should ever sail the ship again, and there was more than a chance that no one might. It rained and blew at the anchorage, and at daylight I looked about me at the Shore Road and Bay Ridge and Manhattan, and all those parts, and it seemed to me all anticlimax. I had gone out and was now returned. I had sailed a long way and was now come in again. I had sailed near 60,000 miles, and I did not know why. I had crossed the lengths and breadths of 4 oceans and 7 seas. I had passed the line 4 times, and had rounded Good Hope and the Horn, and beat out of the Coral Sea, and beat by many reefs, and anchored in strange places and quiet lagoons, and had brought my collection of youth round the world without accident and without loss. For this I thanked God in humility and devoutly, for I knew that above all I had been sustained throughout that voyage, in whatever manner of vicissitude or near calamity that arose, by Providence. There had been much in that voyage to sustain my belief, and nothing to shake it. It rained and blew at the anchorage, and I shifted to a safe berth in the harbor, and tied up at the dock, and the voyage was done. Epilogue. The ship was sold at New York, for I had to sell her. The voyage had cost me all I had, and even with the ship sold I had now nothing. I hauled down the British flag and repatriated my crew. I went out from the Tebo Yard at the foot of 23rd Street in Brooklyn, with the American flag flying from the peak of my ship, seeming incongruous in my eyes, and I went out into the rain-spattered streets, and did not look back again. Brave ship, I remember her now as she lay there, with the rich yachts all round, soon to be converted to be more fit to join them. And there was such grace and steadfastness and loyalty about that old hull, and those tapering spars, and all the beauty and sea kindliness of her, as may never be built into a sailing ship again. The day of all such ships is ended, all such ships and all such crews. It is unlikely that a crew such as I had will ever again be assembled to circumnavigate a square-rigged ship under the British flag. My ship was a good ship, and no better wind ship shall be built. My crew in the end was a good crew, though far from angelic, and a better shall not be signed upon a Cape Horner's articles again. My voyage was a vague thing, and yet it was a voyage, not idly begun, nor profitably continued, but sailed quietly with resolution and some poor ideals from the setting out to the end. And now the crew is gone, scattered about the world, and the ship is gone, and over me again gloomy buildings brood. The gloomy, silent buildings brood, and the pale-faced people hurry, and beneath in the stone caverns of the great city the crowded subway roars, and I wander alone and bewildered by the shore road.